for the August 12th, 2021 teleconference meeting of the Oklahoma City Law Enforcement Policy Task Force. I have a few announcements to make regarding the meeting. Number one, I ask that all participants stay muted until they are recognized to speak. Task force members will be allowed to ask questions or comment at any time during the meeting. Please use the Zoom hand raise feature to speak. The system automatically cues the speakers in the order their hands were raised. Keep in mind, with the large number of members we have on this call, we cannot always see you on the screen if you simply raise your hand. If the video conference is disconnected at any time during the meeting shall be stopped and reconvened once the audio and video connection is restored. If communications are unable to be restored within 15 minutes, the remaining agenda will be placed on the next scheduled meeting's agenda. And if you need to find the agenda is located on okc.gov website, www.okc.gov. Now we'll call the meeting to order. It's good to see everyone here. Hope you enjoyed your month off and are ready to go to work. With that, I'll turn it over to Ganesha Martin with 21 CP.
Thank you, MT. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I hope you all, you're all so busy that sometimes not having a 2-hour meeting could actually end up being a hiatus that you could enjoy. I hope you all maybe got some trips in, some breathing, any of that kind of self-renewal, but we are back. And I hope ready to get to work. As you all know, I always like to just bring us into the room because we're all usually running from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom, or a Zoom to real meeting if you like me, a Zoom in the car, or a Zoom in your office, and then a real meeting. So just to center us, we have hit a milestone in this project. As you all have seen, the city distributed to you the draft recommendations. And so we are at a point that we really need you all to speak into, what you have been able to read, what you have been able to digest. We know you have not been able to spend a lot of time with it, but we also hope that because you've been, for the most part, along the process with us, that some of the stuff is not landing on you as a complete surprise. And so what we really want to do is spend the time today to dig into this, to have the conversations that we need to have, because we are rounding a corner. And so, we'll get into conversation. Brian is going to take us through the recommendations that are specifically tied to the scope of work as laid out for the task force, which is de-escalation and oversight. You all can ask questions. The overall goal is for you to point out, you all missed something. We talked about this, you didn't pick it up, we don't see it here. And so if you're not seeing those things, we might speed through some of these recommendations. But if you're seeing some things that are missing, let us know. The last thing, and I think, the report made this very clear, this is very much preliminary. This is not actually how, the reports normally go. We usually come out with a full report. So this report is almost half of what we would normally write. So a lot of context is not there. It really is boiled down to the bullet points. So the final draft will have much more context to it. But again, the overall goal today is for you all to say you missed this, and to kind of speak into that. So does anybody have any questions about what I said before Brian starts presenting the recommendations, and Jessica will be taking notes as you all speak into the recommendations? I'm scanning through. I don't see any hands. MT, do you see any hands?
I do not.
Okay, let me make sure I don't see Garland's hand waving. All right, boom. Okay, we're good. All right, so if I could get you, Jessica, to share screen.
I'll do it just a second. I'm having a small moment of delay.
Okay. Perfect. All right. And Brian, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think Ganesh did an excellent job framing exactly what this report is, and perhaps more importantly, what it is not. These are our initial recommendations. These are drawn from what we've heard from the working group, from the task force, from discussions with community, from discussions with the police department, other entities in the city. So there's a whole lot of information that went into crafting these. And as Ganesha said, some of them are more fleshed out than others. So we always run into this difficulty in presenting initial recommendations prior to a final report, because when we write a final report, we really show the roadmap of our work, who we talked to, what they said, and we don't use personal identifiers, but certainly conceptually. So if you don't see some of your voice in here as support for any of these recommendations, stay tuned, because we will be adding a lot more of that later. And it's always a little bit of a debate about how much to include in initial recommendations. There are some that have argued that we just do bullet points and that's all we're talking about. We'd like to put a little more meat on the bones ahead of time, knowing full well that questions will remain about each individual recommendation. So what I thought we would do today is really look at the recommendations in the two primary categories that the task force is assigned at looking at, which is really the de-escalation policy and the accountability sections of these recommendations. And as we say in the report, the contract initially tasked us with looking at the de-escalation policy. That actually turned out to be a relatively short inquiry, because the policy, and many on this call have actually talked about it, is actually in pretty good shape. The question is, how do we take what's in that policy and drive to better outcomes overall that can better serve OKC? And so some of the recommendations here, while we have put it into de-escalation, and you will see after each recommendation, we have a little parentheses that explains what, which aspect of what we were asked to look at it applies to. I would say that the de-escalation concept is broader than you might think looking at the scope of work formally. So recommendation number one, I'm just going to jump in, and I will also try to look for hands and questions along the way. This one really is a more philosophical recommendation. The structure of the department's operations manual is that it's divided into policies, procedures, and rules. And in reading this, the way they purport to organize this manual is that policies are really your principles and values. Then the procedure is really more of the guidance, and then the rule is specifics. Here is how you apply policies and the procedures. As a general proposition, I think we find that unnecessarily complex, and it forces officers to look in multiple sections of the operations manual to find out what the specific guidance is in any area. And in fact, there are things that are at the policy level, the procedure level, and the rule level. So in order to fully understand it, you need to read all three. And that's unnecessarily complex. But within that structure, we think that de-escalation should be elevated up to the highest level. In other words, it should be unequivocally stated as a core principle and value of the department in all officer activities. This may be more form over real function, because officers are held accountable to all aspects of the operations manual, but certainly in terms of making a clear, unequivocal statement that this is a core value of the department, we recommend it be moved up. we also, as a side recommendation, say, take a look at the operations manual. It's probably worth revisiting this division and creating a tighter set of rules overall. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions about that recommendation.
I'm not seeing any hands.
Nor am I.
So you're good
Okay.
to go, Brian.
All right, so let's get into some more specific and granular recommendations. So recommendation number 2 really looks at the use of force policy overall. De-escalation is a part of that, but what we're recommending here, and this really connects to recommendation 3, is that the use of force policy divide uses of force based on their severity. And most departments use something like type 1, type 2, type 3, with type 3 being the most serious. Others use levels. And the point of this is to categorize the uses of force and ensure that your reporting and review is tailored to the severity of the force. This does not mean that low-level uses of force are not reported or reviewed. It's just the level of scrutiny that you apply to that would be less than for the mid-tier or high-tier uses of force, where you really are going to want to do a full after-action assessment and try to tease out what the lessons learned. So really, this is more of an internal routing system for review and reporting of use of force. Recommendation number 3 really looks at how the more severe, probably the mid-tier and the top-tier uses of force are reviewed by the department. And one thing that we stress is that departments ideally have strong systems of internal critical self-analysis. And the OKC PD has a use of force screening committee, which is responsible for reviewing uses of force for compliant with written directives. But as written and formulated in policy, it is really looking for policy adherence. In other words, was there a deviation from policy? And what we're recommending, and in talking with the department, it may be this is more of what they are actually doing in practice, even though their policies don't reflect it. But what we're looking for is a more holistic review of force. Sort of top to bottom, looking at training, supervision, equipment, and de-escalation. And I see that Craig has his hand raised.
Yeah, Brian, I was just going to see if you could just do a real quick, or even Deputy Chief Basie, I saw him on too, maybe just a real quick review of the issue right now of the level of review that is done on every use of force, just kind of a review of why you all arrived at this as a recommendation.
So I will defer if the Deputy Chief wants to speak to it.
Here, using your card. Okay, so just put it in that little slot, chip in first. Yep.
Someone's making a purchase.
Got it.
So
You guys
basically,
taking care of it.
So Chief Basie, can you just kind of go through just a really quick elevator speech version of, because I know we talked about it before, but just the level of detail that we go into on every use of force and how we define a use of force. Because I think what Brian's getting to in their recommendation is saying that we going into such a deep dive and a deep review on every single type of use of force doesn't allow us to dig in deeper on those that are more critical, or where there may have been more of an incident there, or someone was injured or even killed, that we aren't able to spend as much time on that, because we have to spend so much time on the other types of use of force. And really, I think what happens in the end is we spend a lot of time on both of them, but what we do is we have supervisors who aren't managing because they're spending all their time reviewing all these uses of force.
Agreed. So we have compared to other agencies around the country, we have a very broad definition of what a use of force is. And a very generic definition of that would be anything that's beyond routine handcuffing and searching could be considered a use of force by our policy. which in other places, maybe like such in California, it's very specific: injury, complaint of injury, or things of that nature. So we are doing follow-up administrative investigations on multiple times more incidents than other agencies our size. And so with that being said, we also do a separate de-escalation review in conjunction with every use of force. So the use of force can be ruled justified, appropriate, or unjustified, inappropriate, but we'll also look at the de-escalation separate from that to see if it was appropriate or inappropriate. So I think what he's saying is we're investigating everything. And it takes away from our ability to really focus, hone in on the ones that really need the attention. That's as, I don't know if that's what you were looking for specifically, but I think, and Brian, I don't want to speak for you, so please tell me if this is where you're getting at. Some things can be not as critical as others. And so we can kind of do a smaller or scale level of review and not as intense, and free those supervisors up to actually focus on the job of actually supervising, but also put that attention on those cases that need it the most.
I see that Dexter has his hand up as well. I just want to respond quickly to what I've just heard is that, yes, we do want more efficient reviews of force. In other words, you don't put the equal amount of energy at the low level as you would with the higher level. But with the higher level, we are really saying that the department needs to formally declare what it is doing. This is both for public consumption and for internal consistency over time. Because what it sounds from our conversations with the department and then looking at the policy, that there's actually a disconnect here where the policy does not require the level of review that the department is actually doing. So we want to take a step back and say, no, you need to clarify this, figure out who's going to be at the table. Are you always going to have a CIT officer present? Are you always going to have a training officer present? Are you always going to have a policy person present to get all of the different viewpoints? And one thing that we also suggest in this recommendation is that for the more serious uses of force, the department consider adding a civilian observer to witness the review and provide the community perspectives. And that would be a far more open and transparent way to go about it. So yes, I would say it would be less at the lower levels, but more at the higher levels with greater transparency and engagement. Dexter?
Yeah, my question was kind of for clarification purposes. Like Chief Basie said, Oklahoma City's definition of use of force is quite broad, which causes him to investigate quite a bit more uses of force than most agencies. So my question is, on number 2, are you saying to redefine the definition or just to leave the definition as it is, but to include different levels of uses of force?
The latter. The definition where it's anything beyond unresisted handcuffing is probably appropriate, including pointing of a firearm. But those lower level uses of force, they require scrutiny by a supervisor. They should be audited, but they don't require the full depth of analysis. Instead, you put that energy and your resources to doing a deeper dive at the higher level. So break it out by level and apply appropriate resources based on level.
Using the same definition. Okay.
And the other thing, just to add to that, we don't have to go into too much minutia, but if you changed your process of overview, then you could also start then reviewing your data on a regular basis to keep up with patterns and trends of what's happening with those lower level uses of force, because you always want to keep an eye on it, even if you're not doing an extensive investigation.
I notice Pastor Jemison has his hand raised.
I would like to ask, how are we distinguishing between lower and higher levels of force?
So different departments do that differently, but typically what it is that, there are things like pointing of a firearm where there is a threat of force, which can be quite impactful for a community member that's experiencing that. And things like, handcuffing pain, where the handcuffs need to be adjusted after the fact, maybe they were too tight. In those sorts of, that's what I'm referring to, low level uses of force, where there's no injury, there's no real complaint of injury, but it's clear that there was something that occurred above unresisted handcuffing. Those do need to be reviewed, because if those, for example, if those handcuffs were put on too tightly and they're intentionally, and there's an allegation of retaliation or excessive force under those circumstances, then that's really a disciplinary review at that point. But just for the, the run of the mill, physical contacts that go beyond unresisted handcuffing, those would be typically level 1. Level 2 is when you start getting into things like harder takedowns, uses of force, handcuffing that actually does lead to a complaint of injury or actual injury, use of taser, use of OC, pepper spray, use of baton, anything that starts using those mid-tier tactics and weapons would be a level 2. Level 3 is categorically something that causes or could cause serious physical injury or death. So for example, if you were to use a baton and strike a leg, that would probably be a level 2. If it hit the sternum, the groin, or the head and potentially could cause serious injury, it could be reviewed as a level 3. So there are sort of categorical ways of looking at this. There's also outcome-based ways of looking at this, where if injury occurs, it brings it up levels regardless of what the intent behind it actually was. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other hands, I will move on to the next set of, actually just number 4, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, is, when, and we know the department is looking at upgrading its records management system, which will be more robust and allow for more detail about officer activities. And throughout this, there's certainly a general recommendation to increase, transparency. If there's officer activities, they should be recorded in the records management system or in the computer-aided dispatch system, and whatever statistics that come out of officer activities should be publicly facing. But here, what we specifically say is use of force statistics, where it's used, severity of it, who it's used on. All of that should be put out in publicly facing statistics. And we recommend both the dashboard, which means it's easily manipulated by the public online, and then also in a raw format that really gets far more granular and allows for researchers to dig into the information. So the next 2 sort of go together, and these really deal with the force review and critical incidents, especially officer-involved shootings. First of all, we recommend shortening the waiting period for interviewing officers who've been involved in this, in one of these critical events. I think, I'm actually going to forget right now, it's either 48 or 72 hours right now in OKC. And it couldn't even be longer than that. And ideally, we submit that best practices are that in most circumstances, the officer could be interviewed before end of shift. This may be a hard one to get to, but we've found it to be best practice in a lot of jurisdictions. And there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which actually really support the officer, and a lot that support the credibility of the department vis-a-vis the public. And certainly the public getting more information earlier has already been a theme in this project. That's why we had the earlier recommendation about putting out objective evidence. This allows the department to get at what the officer did and why earlier in the process than is currently happening. From the officer perspective, the analysis of use of force is always what did the reasonable officer perceive? And this will come up in a few of the other recommendations, but it's not always what actually happened, is what did the officer perceive? And an officer does not give a statement early on in the process and gets a lot more information about what happened during that incident. As we'll get into it, reviews body-worn camera evidence, or talks to other people. At a certain point, their own perception is contaminated by what actually happened. And it is really useful to capture what did that officer perceive, and that can really help the legitimacy of any review, and also has, I won't get too deep into that, but ramifications legally for the officer. I'm just going to do number 6, and then we'll turn to questions here. Number 6 basically is related to that. And basically, you should give your statement before you review your video evidence. And again, it is because there's a lot of research that shows that viewing video evidence changes your perception. It's not an intentional thing. It's not always that the officer's trying to subvert the process and give testimony based on what they saw in the video, but it just happens naturally. So what we recommend is you tell officers they got to give that perceptual statement up front, but the policy needs to be balanced with clear language that says we do not expect the officer's perception to match up perfectly with the video. Officers do not perceive things like a camera does. They have emotions, they have cortisol, they have a lot of things that go into this. They're also looking in different directions than their body camera might be facing. So it's important to get the perceptual statement. It's important to review the video afterwards. And it is important to ask the officer about any differences between what the video shows and the officer's perception. You, as part of the investigation, you explore that with the officer, but in a way that it doesn't make every difference accusatory. And at that way, we found that that's the best way to actually get to the truth of what happened and draw the best lessons learned from that. So let me pause there because I'm sure there are questions on that.
Ed Kowinski has his hand raised.
Yep. Brian, or maybe the chief can tell us, is there a current practice, policy, or anything through the police officer fraternal organization that provides for legal representation to an officer who's been involved in let's say, a critical incident during the time of the interview?
Yes, they are afforded legal representation through the FOP.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Dexter Nelson.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that and also some clarification. This is one of those 5 and 6 are obviously going to have to be negotiated through FOP because there is current policy on that. But a little bit of clarification. Are we talking about on 5 and 6 on major use of force incidents or all incidents in general, as far as not allowing officers to view the video before making a report?
So that is an excellent question. And we will flesh this out in the final report. Generally, what we would recommend is that in critical incidents, these type 3 incidents where there is an interview of the officer, not a written statement, that's where this comes into play. If an officer is simply writing a written statement and you don't have the ability to test their memory in this back and forth that I described earlier, it's much less imperative, and they probably should review the video. More importantly, if they're writing an arrest report, we actually would encourage them to review the video. And the reason for that is, there are times when you review the video and realize you got it all wrong. This person didn't do what you thought, or, there's a way to, you go, hey, we need to step back from this and I got to talk to supervisor, maybe we cut this person loose. If you've got a person in custody and the validity of that could be impacted by the video, then there are reasons to do that affirmatively. So this recommendation is for what we would call the type 3 critical event, high use of force, officer involved shooting role.
Okay, I don't see any other hands.
Nor do I.
Okay, I will move on to recommendation number 7. And there was a lot of discussion, both the task force and the working group about this. And, on one hand, there was a discussion about whether all officers should be CIT officers, or what percentage should be of the department should have the training. And we talked a lot about the distinction between a 40-hour, what we would call certified officer, as opposed to an 8-hour trained officer, and a lot of departments refer to that as mental health first aid. The distinction between these two is actually, the gap's been closed, because all incoming officers now receive 24 hours of mental health training. So the distinction between the 24 and the 40 is less significant than it was when we started this project, or at least in our understanding. But that being said, currently there's 158 authorized CIT positions, and they're not all filled right now, and some of them are still being filled. And this was based ostensibly on the CIT International recommendation of 20 to 25% of the department to be CIT officers. OKC PD made it very clear this was a floor, not a ceiling. And if you have willing officers that can get this greater training, we see absolutely no reason why you should not do that. You should not do that and assume that solves all the problems. And there are other recommendations relating to alternative response, but it's not an either or situation. It's an and situation in our perception. So, and we realize there's premium pay, there are other potential issues with increasing this number, but I think we think those can be overcome and should be. And once you have additional resources of CIT officers, the department should continue to look very hard at how they're deploying that, make sure every shift, every district has an appropriate number. Currently, dispatchers are cross-dispatching CIT officers, so they are an identified resource for the department, which is good, and that should continue. But even in that initial deployment, spread them out, make sure you've got full coverage.
So thanks, Brian. Garland, I saw you waving your hand. You're on mute.
Yeah, that's a very important area, and my concern has everything to do with at the present time. How far are we off now is not having those particular positions filled? But that's the first question. And I think that number needs to be definitely increased from the 20-25%. And I'm saying it because we checked some of the other departments other than Oklahoma City departments, and a lot of theirs, the numbers are much, much higher as far as percentage of those trained in that particular area. Now, I'm just curious now, since we're talking about de-escalation and we're talking about filming. So now, the incident that took place this week, where we got 25 cars, 2 battering ram cars, and we know that it's a mental issue. How do we resolve that on a de-escalation plan and in that written report? The final report was he ended up with nobody killed, with nobody shot, with nobody harmed, and we knew it was a mental issue going in. Why would we deploy 25 cars plus 2 battering rams? I'm just curious, what category would that fall in when it comes to that report of it was resolved? And the reason for the question, carry on.
I was just going to say, I am not intimately familiar with this incident, so there's a lot there that I cannot speak to. I don't know if anyone else from the city wants to speak to that, but
I guess that would fall right back in that category as making those particulars available within 24 hours of the same day of. Those would be considered deaths, but just the incident itself in general, how would we approach that in a de-escalation section if by chance that was a major concern? Because for too often, we have a tendency to, some of us think of overkill, too many, and that type of thing. That's the way the public perceives it more often than not. If I got 25 cars and it ain't no killing, ain't no shooting, ain't no beat down, somebody banished the gun, although we know it's a mental issue, and we know that going in, how do we address that?
well, I think a lot of the recommendations that we have in here start to talk to that. We've got some that are coming up about what dispatch knows, what they have access to, how they dispatch calls. There are recommendations for continuing crisis and mental health training that would go throughout a career, including up into the chain of command, to make sure that everyone is current on current operations and best practices around such deployments. I don't know this incident, but if there was a battering ram and multiple officers dismissed or dispatched, I would, well, I don't want to guess here,
Okay, well,
but that sounds.
Brian, let's not deal with that. Let's not deal with that particular one. So now I guess the other reason for the question, like you were saying, at the present time, we're under numbers as far as CIT training. The 24 hours being covered in those areas, although we're short. In other words, every shift is still being covered. We're just not having the numbers as far as the 25% is concerned. So we're covered on 24 hours a day, but all positions are not filled. We need more of them. Is that what the issue is?
Well, and that's the recommendation. Yes, get more officers out there in all shifts and districts that are fully trained in this area.
And Brian, I'd just add too that Deputy Chief Basie, you step in if I'm misstating anything, but I think the issue with the training with our current numbers that we have authorized and not all those being filled, a lot of that's just with retirements. We've had a significant number of retirements for various reasons recently. And as we have retirements and then we get new officers in, or we're getting new officers trained in that full CIT training and getting them certified, it's just a matter of the turnover time of, we have a vacancy, we've got to get a new group in, get a new class together, and get the training going on that. So all the officers are still getting the 24 hours of training, but getting to that CIT certification is just a matter of turnover, not something that we're planning to keep it under that number. We're still working to try to get back up to that number right now. And then beyond that, with the recommendation that, at least as it's drafted right now from 21 CP and with the task force, is to increase that number further. And I think we're all on board with that.
I want to apologize. I don't have the hand raise feature, so I've missed a couple of opportunities here. You're absolutely right. We've had a lot of turnover. We've had a lot of people leave, and that training is not something you can just do the following week. That's something that has to be coordinated, scheduled. We do it in conjunction with other community partners. I believe the State Department of Mental Health is part of that. So in order to get that number back up, we have to, again, schedule a training and identify people who want to do this job. And the reason why it's a voluntary position is it's like anything else. It's a skill set, and you don't want someone who doesn't have the desire and isn't invested in it being in those critical situations. And so it's like being any other specialized bomb tech or a negotiator, or whatever the case may be. You want people who are invested in that process and really want to do that. So we do have plans in the future to try to get those numbers up. We're trying to get this training scheduled. So that's the short answer to that. I'll roll back just half a second. I didn't really want to touch upon an incident at this point because it's not all public knowledge, but there are just going to be times, if you refer specifically to an incident where we have information that there is a potential for violence and potential access to weapons. And so that it requires a higher type of response, and that response is geared towards the safety of all people involved. In that particular incident, that person surrendered. So what you see when you see a tactical response, that also includes negotiators. So a CIT officer may be great, but if they're walking up to a house exposed, that creates a greater potential for a confrontation. And so sometimes when we have those situations, it does require a different type of response. But even that tactical response has a lot of de-escalation tactics built into it that they utilize first, but they do so in a manner that doesn't, we don't have battering rams, and it's not to be confrontational here. We do have tactical vehicles, and that's just to provide protection and allow us to move in and address the issue without forcing the confrontation and exposing people. So thank you.
Reggie Hines has his hand raised.
Yes, my question is there a reason why the CIT training is not mandatory is not mandatory training for all officers?
So I'll start this one again. Deputy Chief Basie's going to know more about this, but CIT training is required for all. I mean, so the mental health training or mental health response training is required for all officers. Every officer gets 24 hours, and then they get the what's referenced here in the report. They get an update every year. They'll get 2 additional hours of training every year. The full certification comes into not just the level of training, but also whether or not they're certified to be called out as a CIT officer. And that is something that's being discussed. I think it's a really good point. That's something that's being discussed is, would we be able to budget, or it's budgeting time at this point to get all officers go through that full training? That's definitely something that's up for discussion.
Okay.
Grace Franklin. Thank you, Reggie. Next up is Grace Franklin.
Yes, so my question is, when we're looking at increasing the CIT trained officers, and just to clarify, when we're talking about CIT trained officers, I'm talking about the ones that are designated. So the 40 plus hour officers, the ones who are designated as CIT. Are we looking, what is the process that we're looking at to determine what the percentage is needed in Oklahoma City? Like if we decide it's 38%, what are the factors that we're looking at to increase the numbers and determining, what would be a good point for Oklahoma City? What are we looking at? What factors?
I'll step in and I'll answer that. In short, we're actually wanting to get back up to full strength. We're scheduling a school where we want to identify people who are voluntarily going to want that assignment or that designation. All of us receive, as our city manager, Craig Freeman, stated, 24 hours of mental health training throughout the year. We also we build that into other blocks of our training where our reality-based training, and we have scenarios that incorporate confrontations with people with mental illness and de-escalation opportunities to practice de-escalation. But that's not an answer to your question. The question is, part of the recommendations is looking at what we could do or should do in the future to increase our ability to interact with people who are in mental crisis. And so we take these recommendations seriously. We are following what is considered a national standard for our model. It doesn't mean we're not open to reevaluating that at this point.
May I ask you a question? Have you ever, either from a workload study or a call for service number, said we have this, and I know you're in the middle of getting a new records management system, so your data systems might not allow you to do this, but we have this many calls for service that involve people in mental and behavioral health crisis. In order to cover that, we would need this amount of officers. Has any type of study like that or anything ever been done? And I mean, Oklahoma Police Department. I'm asking if you all have ever done.
I'm not aware, Ganesha, that we've ever done. Chief, do you know if we've ever done a specific study on that?
I'm not aware of that. What I can tell you is we do track our CIT responses and the results of those, whether or not they were transported to a mental health facility or some other place, and that's based on certain criteria from the call. But the comparative study that you're referring to, I'm not aware or not sure if we've done that or not.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is with our information that we have right now, being able to do some studies like that and looking at what information we have as part of our basis. But I think to the question originally from Grace was, about what would we use as a basis. And I think going back and looking at some of our data on the number of calls where we need a CIT, situations where we had difficulty getting a CIT out, but also looking at some best practices, not just like an industry standard that's out there that's recommended that we're currently following, but to see if there's other departments that have some best practices that we'd want to use to say, like she said, is it 30%? Is it 38%? Is there a number that we want to target differently? I think some more research on that is worthwhile to give us a basis from which we come back with that recommendation.
I do want to, can I just say one thing? I'm sorry. I appreciate your answer, Chief Basie, and everybody from the city. Actually, my question was directed towards 21 CP, and I apologize. I probably should have preferenced that. It's more so, are you all looking at any ways to help the police department and the city come up with ways to determine the number or percentage? That, I'm sorry,
yes.
I should have directed that the correct way. Sorry about that, but I appreciate Chief Basie.
I appreciate the question. The answer is yes. And, we have looked at how the city tracks crisis response, attempted suicide calls, and the dispositions, specifically about whether there was an arrest or custodial intervention. What currently exists is not as sophisticated as it should be. And if you look down to recommendation number 16, which is in the alternative response to mental health calls section, which there's inevitable overlap between crisis and mental health, obviously. Here, what we're talking about is that as the city invests in the new records management system, it really needs to ensure that it's gathering pretty granular data about crisis calls and interactions with people with mental health challenges. And in particular, what we are encouraging is that the system be designed so that it will gather specific information about individuals. So if Brian is a known person with mental health issues out on the street in Oklahoma City, it may well be that the officers that encounter me regularly know what my triggers are, how I respond to police, who my social worker is. They may have all that information, but we'd like to see that information and data entered into a system so that officers have information. Brian doesn't like eye contact, don't touch him, whatever it is that might be my trigger. And what we recommend is that this be behavior-based. Doesn't matter what my diagnosis is. It matters how I'm going to respond and who my, any support system that I have, the contact information to get them engaged. In that same process, when you start gathering all of that granular data on mental health and crisis contacts, you start getting a much better view citywide about what those contacts look like, how frequent they are, and what percentage of your police service should be fully trained to deal with that level. So it's really based on categorizing, identifying the calls, which can always be a little bit tricky because what a call comes in as and what it's resolved as can be two very, very different things. So but once you have more data and information, you can start building the proper level of response. And I will say that there are departments that have 60 to 70% CIT certified 40-hour trained officers. So there's a lot of room to grow here. Does that help answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Next up is Reverend Dickerson.
Thank you, MT. My question, looking at the recommendations and hearing that as far as we know that there's a deficit of CIT officers and that it's a voluntary position. I'm wondering, as far, I didn't see anything in the recommendations around the criteria for those who want to be, who want to take that training and serve in that position? Like, are everyone who volunteers, is, or is
So, I'm sorry, Reverend Dickinson, can you go back? We lost you right before. Is everyone, we didn't get to hear that that last part. You went out for a second.
I was saying, like, is everyone who volunteers, are they accepted into the program? Or is there a process of application beyond just volunteering? Because it gives me concern. Everyone who might have the desire to serve as a CIT officer might not be appropriate or technically qualified to do it, even with the amount of training. Like, it's not a good fit for everyone who may volunteer. And I didn't see anything in the recommendations that kind of focused on that. That may be more posed toward someone with the city, and possibly Deputy Chief Basie may be able to kind of shed some light on that. But I was just wondering, when we were talking about, I know you're trying to recruit, but is it just a free-for-all, or are there certain things that look at to say these people may be great fits, and do you do targeting recruiting for that position?
That's a good question, and I don't have a specific answer for you. I can get you a better answer a little later on. What I can tell you is that when there is an opportunity for a school, and CIT is no different, or training, we advertise that, and those decisions are, people apply for that. And so there is a selection process, but I can't speak to the specifics of that process. It's not a free-for-all. We'll only have so many slots. We'll have so many people put in. So they'll fill out an application, CIT application, and they'll submit it. And there's a selection process, but I don't know the specifics.
Thank you.
Thank you. ACM Sudal?
Just a quick comment on your notes, Jessica. I think another part to add is also looking at, if as we go forward, and I don't know if we have this data right now or not, but also the time spent, not just the number. I know Councilman Cooper and I did some ride-alongs a few weeks ago, and I know he got on one call that lasted like 2+ hours, so that shows up as one call, but it's a very long, sometimes it can be very long in nature. And then one other thing that I was going to bring up today that I think is relatively new to me, but I'm getting plugged in, and so is Chief Gorley and our 911 director. This 988 issue, and I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but there's a federal deal that's pushing to have a new phone number that's 988 that's specifically for mental health calls. And I actually attended the first meeting today it's not the first meeting they've had, it's the first meeting I got involved with, the 988 Coalition, which is something with mental health providers, and it's really being run by the state Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. And I think, the theory behind it is that most mental health calls and suicide calls and things like that would filter through this 988 number, and there would be, we're still working on, it's very, very, very early in the process, but we would still be working on how that interacts and the handoff with 911. But I just think we ought to note that, because it could be that we start ramping up our CIT response, and this is also going to affect some of the other things the working group's working on. And then if that comes online, which I think they're saying they're shooting for like July of 2022, that could potentially start taking a lot of calls and things related to that. So I just think it's one we ought to flag. I don't have a lot more information than that today, but it could be something that complements all of this, and it could affect what our percentages are and some of our other things that are related to some of the things the working group's doing. And also really quick, Garland's been waving his hand for a while, so I just want to make sure somebody's MT and Ganesha, you're aware of that.
Thank you, Kenny. Go ahead, Garland.
You're muted, Garland.
Yeah, the stat says that 60–80% of most calls are mental issues. I would think that that would play a role in the dictation of the training itself. Now, my other concern would be, somebody just made mention of 40% of those that are CIT trained in some special department. I'm under the impression that management has the right to job assignment. Dictate that in order to cover that 70–80% of most calls are mental cases. Management has the right to job assignment. You can assign those to make sure that those 24-hour shifts are covered. And I'm sure, I have no doubt in my mind, I'm sure some of those with the training are sitting up in the office, not about to go out and do anything concerning dealing with those particular types of cases.
Okay, thank you, Garland. The next hand raised is Joshua Higginbotham.
Yeah, so my main question regarding the CIT, and this is kind of a similar question I had earlier on with the de-escalation earlier on this year when we were discussing, because we're talking about best practices and things. Are there any actual studies that show that CIT training changes outcomes? That you guys know, 21CP, that you know of, that we could be provided with? I mean, I understand the sort of the theory of why it would be good and why it would, and I mean, as a basic part of training, I mean, I could certainly see that, having that sort of knowledge base and maybe some other techniques, but are there actual studies that have been done that you know of?
Brian, I don't know that of any studies that show directly the connection between, not to say that they're not out there. This is not my area of specialty. We certainly can look into it. But Brian, do you know of any that make that connection? I think, Josh, really what's happened is this started, and you probably already know all this, but started in a lot of different ways, but the Memphis model really took off, and I'm forgetting the guy's name who put it together, but what generally happens in policing, for good or for bad, because investments generally are not made in innovation, they are not made in research and development. You get a best practice that happens, and other police departments start doing it and following it. And it's really only very select processes that sometimes happen in academic institutions and never make it even to police departments' operations or practices. So I don't know of any. It's usually somebody has developed something, other police departments start doing it because there's nothing else. And not doing anything when we have the amount of folks that are being killed because of their mental and behavioral health crisis and the way that those manifest. I think this is what police departments are finding that they do until and if something better is actually developed. So Brian, I don't know if you know any specific.
The American Academy of Psychology and Law Enforcement, I believe it was, I don't know that acronym right. They put out a study this year looking at, I think 2 decades worth of CIT interventions, but focusing strongly on the last decade. And much of their research did show improvement in attitudes and reduction of stigma for police officers who received the training, which then had good evidence to see positive response at the police officer level and how they reacted in a CIT case. So essentially the education and better understanding of mental health trauma and mental health response need allowed them to be more sensitive to CIT situations in the field. They also did some pre-booking look. I don't know more about it than that, but it has been studies that looked at multiple models, including the Memphis model, which is the premier model. Sorry, Brian, I cut you off. But Josh, I believe you want to see, I'm going to try the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. And it's essentially something to the title of effectiveness of CIT. So I've gotten you close enough. You can Google that.
Nate
And-
Tarver? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Chief Tarver, you have your hand raised.
Yes, sir. Thanks, MT. I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to say was that, most of us police administrators, we want CIT trained officers, okay? And I know for my department here, I try to get the numbers up as high as I can get them. Some of the things that keep us from doing that, I think Chief Basie mentioned part of this is getting the mental health, the people that are in mental health, their availability and availability of classes, training classes. They are rare to come across, to be scheduled because of all the components to put one together, I would assume. But whenever there is one that's available, they fill up pretty quickly. And so we're all in competition in this metro area. We're trying to get our officers trained, the many departments that are out here. So that goes to something that needs to be considered when we try to do that. I agree with Chief Basie in that, not all officers have that capacity or to be those types of people that should be working as CITs, but we do want to get as many of our people trained and certified as CITs as possible. A couple other things that need to be taken into consideration is the fact that all calls that end up being classified as mental health, they don't come out as mental health calls. So we don't know what we're going to get sometimes until we get there. And then even the calls that come out as mental health calls, they may not actually be mental health call. It may be, someone who's intoxicated or some other issue that comes into play. I think, we're probably all reaching for the same thing. It's just how we get there and what the obstacles are to get to that point of getting our officers CIT trained. Garland had made mention about some of the people in training, and I don't know if things have changed there. Chief Basie can speak to this, but there's a full-time training staff, but all the people that teach CIT and some of these other disciplines, they rely on the actual working officers to come in to teach some of those classes. So there's not like a big group of officers sitting in the training area waiting for a phone call to come in to say they need to respond to one thing or the other or not to respond. Those officers, a lot of those involved in the training are actually out there working. So
I'm going to thank you for that, Chief. I'm going to do a time check. We've been on this subject matter for 30 minutes and we have about another hour. So if it's okay, I'd like to go ahead and move on and parking lot this. And if we have more time at the end, circle back, but go ahead and move so that we can spend some time also on the oversight issues. If there's any strong objections, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to let Brian continue to move through. Okay, I don't see anything, Brian, so I think you can go forward.
Okay, let's drop down to number 8. So this starts to speak about who in the department would be willing to engage in this kind of work and what type of officers you're hiring. We recommend the city consider preference points for applicants that have demonstrated mental health experience, certifications, degrees, or social work experience. And there may be others. I mean, some departments have done preference points around language, but what we're looking for is if you are going to value thoughtful engagement with people in crisis and with mental health concerns, getting people that already have training and experience in that and are already aligned with that, it's an asset to the department. So that goes to hiring. Number 9 here, this is actually, seems like a small recommendation, but it's actually a very important one. It impacts quite a few different areas that we were asked to look at. Is if the city should create a standing crisis intervention committee. These things go by different names, but what it is a body that brings together police, other public safety stakeholders, community resources, any sort of mental health providers, academics, sometimes the judiciary, if you have a mental health diversion court or other aspects, everyone that's involved in problem solving around mental health issues within the city, you bring them together on a quarterly basis to discuss how things are working, what changes to policy should happen, what resources have changed. We found in a lot of cities, a lot of the stuff is nonprofit based, and they come in and out of existence sometimes suddenly. So knowing what changes to the resource base has occurred and keeping that current is very, very valuable. Some cities use this to look at, at incidents that involve mental health responses and that may have had poor outcomes, and how do you do better? And it's also a body that can vet policy changes and suggest trainings to the department. So it becomes almost a mental health think tank for the city on its approach, because we can sit here and we can draft a bunch of recommendations that may be true in 2021. You go 3 or 4 years down the road, and the science, the research, the understanding of what works and what doesn't changes, and this creates a standing body to evaluate that. And it's been very successful at getting people on the same page in other jurisdictions. One other aspect to this is, if you recall, we talked about a potential civilian observer on the Forest Review Board. This also could help identify external mental health resources to also serve on that internal review process. So things end up being interrelated. So we think this is a critically helpful thing to do around, de-escalation, crisis training, alternative responses. So that, I'm not seeing any hands, and we can certainly circle back to that, but that was the section that we identified as relating to de-escalation. There may well be more down in the alternative to mental health response that overlap with de-escalation. So time willing, we can circle back to that. But I guess that's what we have right now for de-escalation, and we should move into accountability unless there are questions, comments, concerns at this point.
Or something that folks think we missed that we've talked about before today.
Yeah, this is Gary Woods. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just got a question about the officers who are CIT trained, and I'm actually circulating or referencing this as it relates to competencies of the officer. Is the expectation of those who are trained, is the expectation that their outcomes are going to be different than those who are not trained?
I missed part of your question, but it sounds like the same question that Josh asked a few minutes ago that we addressed. Is it different somehow that I missed?
Well, what Josh was asking earlier was, is there any data that the outcomes are better? What I'm asking is the expectation internally within the department, is the expectation expected to be better?
I see.
When a CIT trained officer is involved in this de-escalation issue as compared to one that is does not hold the certification.
So I'm speaking the competency between the two officers, one that holds a certification versus one that doesn't. I'll step in a little bit on this, but I'm a little bit out of my lane with Deputy Chief Basie's going to have far more information. I would say from our perspective, we would hope the outcomes would be the same. We'd have a good outcome, but the reality is, and really back to some of the discussion previously, that I think the question of officers applying and wanting to be in the program, and then getting that higher level of training and certification and being vetted through a process, and Chief Basie is going to follow up on that to make sure he knows what that process is. But I do believe there's some type of vetting that's done to make sure that the command staff believes this is someone who's well qualified for this. So it's someone who wants to be there, the department believes is qualified, and then they get that higher level of training. And I would say, yes, absolutely. We would expect if we can get them on scene, we get a better outcome. And so, Chief, you can step into that and correct me if I misstated anything there.
No, you didn't. The expectation is that we're giving certain officers who volunteer for this program additional training, additional tools to be able to deal with people who are in mental crisis. And so the hope is that the outcome would be different. It doesn't make the other officer less incompetent per se. It just means this other person has a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more training in dealing with people who are in mental crisis. But as previously stated, all officers get mental health training annually, and it's been built into other aspects of our training, like reality-based training, what have you. But we would hope that the additional training would be beneficial, and we would potentially get a better outcome for that.
Okay. So you're hoping there is not an expectation that the outcome would be better from those group of trained officers, hoping for it. And that's what I'm trying to drill down to. You know, is there, from a competency standpoint and evaluation standpoint, an expectation that these group of trained officers will have a better outcome? They're expected to respond differently. They're held to a higher standard, things of that nature.
Well, we want to put realistic expectations on people, and mental crisis, mental illness is an unpredictable scenario, and you never know how that's going to turn out. So it's not really fair to say to someone that you're held to a higher standard because you have this training. What you can do is maybe give a better or a more knowledgeable effort, or utilize some additional training you have to try to persuade the outcome of that to be a little bit more favorable. But the expectation is kind of a little heavy. It's our desire, it's our hope, it's our wish that that extra training makes the difference in critical situations. Did that answer your question, Gary?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay, so I see that Dexter put his hand down when I closed the conversation, then he put it back up, and then I see, okay, it's down. All right, perfect. So Brian, go ahead and move on to accountability.
All right, so if you've read the recommendations here, I think you will see that they are, I guess I would call them slightly less specific or normative than some of the other ones, because what they're, it really moves a lot into the next phase, phase 3, which is the feasibility study, because we need to have more conversations about this. We cited to the subcommittee's letter to the city that explained what, you know, all of the considerations that that subcommittee, where they landed. And there's a lot of stuff to explore there. But some of the themes that we gathered from both talking to the community, the working group, and the task force is, first of all, almost no one in the community knows what the Citizens Advisory Board actually is. Its effectiveness is very limited by the fact that nobody knows anything about it. And there were a lot of concerns that were raised about the membership design, who's on it, the transparency of their appointments, term limits, how long they've been there, and whether they're actually serving the goals of the CAB itself. So the first recommendation, number 10, really is you need to take a look at this, what you currently have, because what we heard is that a lot of people on that board are perceived as being, you know, defenders of the status quo of the police department, being resistant to change, being less open-minded than many wanted to see. That being said, a lot of what we heard was you don't need to scrap the CAB completely. It's not, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, because some of the authority that they currently have is not being exercised. The composition of the membership may not be ideal, but it doesn't prohibit rearranging that so that it will have better outcomes on the board. So the first one is looking at the structure, the makeup, and the appointments and how long they're on it. I'll pause there just for a second.
I don't see any hands, Brian.
Okay, and I say a lot of these issues get moved into phase 3 to see what's possible, what's feasible, what bounces up against the city charter, and really what needs to be, as we triage these issues, which we can accomplish in short, medium, and long term. But some of the things that I think we heard loud and clear was that the CAB should have greater access to records to ensure their visibility into operations. I think there was a strong sense that they did not have adequate access. The city should consider giving the CAB a direct investigatory role into officer complaints, including whether that role should include subpoena authority. So, there's a question about how direct the investigatory role is, and if it's increased, what powers and authorities should be given to the CAB. And again, that really needs to be explored. How the arbitration process can be modified so that the recommendations are taken seriously, because there's a sense that any recommendations coming out of the CAB are not taken seriously by the department, which, if that's the case, then we need to figure out how to increase the authority, or, in some jurisdictions, what they have is, if you're not going to accept the recommendation of a civilian oversight board, you need to put in writing to generally the electeds, the city council, as to why you're not going to follow that recommendation and why you're deviating. In other words, transparency. And then there was a lot of discussion about the role the CAB might have in reviewing and helping to develop policy of the department. I will pause there.
I don't see any hands.
Gloria
Oh, there's
Torres.
Gloria. Okay.
Hi, this is Gloria. Thank you. I just wanted to add a comment to the first one of having access to records to ensure visibility into operations. I think one of the largest concerns with that was timely access, where the CAB was often receiving situations that were at least 2 years old. And so that almost makes it irrelevant, at least for that immediate situation. But the timeliness of having access was one of the biggest concerns, I believe.
Thank you. That's an important clarification. And, that is what we heard. It has to be genuine access, or it's not worth having.
I don't see any other hands.
So moving into number 12, as I said earlier, there's really a lack of knowledge about what the CAB does, what its authority is, what role it has vis-a-vis the community. And we just recommend that there be a comprehensive education campaign to highlight the work and the authority, get the word out what this entity is, and why it's important to policing in OKC. And if any changes are made or updates, that can be part of the education process. Number 13, this is a very technical one. Really, it comes down to so to its credit, the city allows and accepts anonymous complaints against officers. Many cities don't go down that road at all. But the reality is that the easiest way to complain is to do so online. And the current system right now there's a filled PDF complaint form, and on that complaint form, it requires you to have an affirmation and a signature on every single page, which, that goes contrary to the idea of an anonymous complaint. It also makes it very formalistic in requiring that signature. Some departments require, some sort of sworn testimony or affirmation. That's not quite what this is, but it certainly could have a chilling effect on somebody's willingness to file that complaint. And, I know there's always a concern that the more you have with, more anonymous complaints you have, the more false allegations you have. And some departments make the big mistake of going and, filing charges against people that make false allegations. Our experience is people don't generally take the time to do that, and that, the complaints are generally legitimate, and the ones that are not or are frivolous, they get weeded out during the investigation phase anyway. So again, very technical one, but make sure there is a genuine way to do anonymous complaints online, and a web form is generally the best way to do that. So those are technically the, oh, Dexter, sorry.
I'm sorry, I just got a real quick question. Having worked as an investigator for years, it's difficult to investigate something we don't know who to talk to. So would that be an option of having them optionally leave their name so you have a point of reference to start with?
Yeah, I'm not in any way suggesting that all complaints should be anonymous. No, and I recognize the investigative difficulty if you don't have the information for follow-up. But it should be an option, and sometimes it's enough to get the ball rolling. So.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. And then Brian, does that take us to the last recommendation?
It does technically.
Okay.
I feel like there are some in here that have overlap that are worth exploring, even though they're technically in the sections that go to the working group, but some of them are overlap. So I just wanted to run through a few of those, if that's okay.
Okay, we have one question or comment from John Middendorf.
Thank you, Brian. I was on that subcommittee with Grace and Josh Higginbotham and several others to work on this civilian oversight recommendation. And I understand you said earlier that a lot of this that we're seeing today is just sort of a fleshed out bullet point. Obviously, we submitted a whole lot more than you were able to put here. But it strikes me that what we put down, and I'm certainly happy for Josh or Grace to speak into this as well, is pretty far reaching. And I'm just curious, and forgive me if this feels like a loaded question. I don't mean for it to be, but having seen the scope of what it is that we recommended as a subcommittee, in your experience in working with other municipalities, what do you perceive will be the biggest challenge in getting all the way there, if theirs is representative of where it is that we hope as a subcommittee that we could get to, as it has to do with strengthening the CAB?
So the reason we wanted to really focus in on this on phase 3 is there are a lot of potential issues. Certainly there would be union negotiations. There are charter issues that would require both political and practical engagement to see what, where the will is to move forward on this. There are some things that may conflict with state law that we're trying to suss out as well. And any of these could be barriers, because yes, and we did cite to the letter in here because we didn't want that voice to be lost, because you guys did a lot of work and put forth a pretty comprehensive document, but we really need to dig into that more on a granular level. So that's, are there any number of potential roadblocks to it, but on the other hand, there's a lot to consider. So that's where we find ourselves today.
Okay, was there any other questions or any other folks from that subcommittee that wanted to speak into that? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So if you want to go forward, Brian.
Okay.
Brian, would you like me to keep sharing screen and you'll shout out the number, or do you want me to take that down?
Let's keep it up on the screen, and let's just drop down to number 14. So this goes to some of the comments that I think were raised today, which really is that there needs to be a specific and comprehensive training plan for crisis intervention officers and mental health. And what's difficult is you have people coming and going. You're always onboarding new officers that they come in and are available as a patrol resource. You have others that are promoting out and are no longer a designated resource and probably shouldn't be counted in the total anymore. You have officers that have been doing this for quite a long time, and they shouldn't be having the same old repetitive training looped around. And I'm not saying this is what's happening, but this is the plan that really should be out there, because there's so many nuances to what you can educate officers in. And it's not, when you talk about crisis intervention, I'm looking at it very broadly. It's not just mental health. Part of that can be cultural competency. Part of that can be specific mental health diagnoses. Some of that can be chemical dependency and how that behavior kicks in. Some of that can actually overlap with youth and how youth respond to authority. And there's just such a breadth of opportunity for developing and bringing new issues to help train officers. So what we're recommending here is there be a comprehensive training plan. It's usually on a 5-year cycle that has basic CIT for incoming officers, the certification for some percentage of officers, but then continued development within that area for CIT officers, or perhaps for all officers, depending on what the topic is. But when you put out a plan like that, what you end up doing is cementing it into the training curriculum. It helps with budget decisions, it helps with continuity over time, and it makes consistent training not dependent on present leadership that may have a greater emphasis on that in training, that shouldn't go away no matter who becomes the leader of the department. And in talking with the department, they have a new reality-based training unit that is really focused in on scenario-based training, and for us that's the gold standard. If you can get officers, put them into situations, run them through repetitions where they're having to use those skills and can be stopped midstream, debriefed, critiqued, it really helps develop those skills a lot better than the theory. We've sat through a lot of CIT classes that are simply recitation of, schizophrenia presents this way. This is what to expect. Move on to the next diagnosis. Doing it in real time with role players, with scenario-based training is much, much better. Dropping down to recommendation number 15. This is dealing with alternative responses to mental health calls. So again, potential overlap here with the whole de-escalation concept. We're not just saying that only police officers should be responding, that only CIT officers are qualified to handle that. What we're saying is up the number of CIT officers, ensure that they are comprehensively trained, do your best in that area, and try to figure out, actually number 15, please, Jessica. Find out what resources you have. And there's been a lot of discussion and presentations about the current, what we would call, it's more of an investigative follow-up resource at NorthCare, where once there's a mental health crisis, NorthCare can follow up with services. Currently, it's not a co-responder model. There have been a lot of discussions about making it a co-responder model, or having just a non-police based response. I think the biggest thing that we think there's a need here is And this can be called an RFP or a request for solutions or request for information. There's many different models for this, but what we see is that the city really needs to identify mental health and crisis response as an issue. If it's seeking non-law enforcement based solutions to that, who can actually help with that? Because there's a lot of discussion that's happened more in the working group about whether an organization like North Care would be accepted in certain communities, and it would be better to have a community-based resource. And we talked a lot about in this forum and in that other forum about models like Cahoots and the STAR program, and NYPD has actually had a lot of very strong success using civilians for mental health deployment. The question is, who can actually do it? Who has the capacity? Who in your community can be part of a network of support on that? And that's sort of the first step, is to identify who's got the chops to actually do this. And you find that out by asking. So that's our recommendation number 15.
And Josh has his hand up.
Yeah, so I've got two questions. Number one, I'm wondering what, because myself and Grace Franklin were doing that. And found organizations and individuals and then reported back to the working group about it. So I'm kind of wondering, I mean, I agree that this is like really important. I'm kind of wondering what we were doing, if not that. And secondly, North Care is mentioned twice in here, which is interesting. I don't remember any discussion about everyone agreeing that an expansion of their pilot program seemed to be the best way of going about this. I mean, we've talked with North Care, with others, and their pilot has nothing really to do with a mental health alternative response program like the Denver Star that we've been in contact with, the actual people who designed and are implementing that program right now. So I'm wondering where it seems to me that this one here is very disconnected with the actual discussion and the people that I know that have been sort of like looking at the alternative response.
Thanks for asking this, Josh. And we talked about this a bit in the working group. I'm going to be straightforward. We need to re-language this part of this section, and it confused Grace as well if she wants to speak into this when we did it in the working group. If you're careful to read the language, and what we were trying to say was, we understood your call to action that perhaps North Care wasn't the only and best response for mental health providers in the city of Oklahoma. And we wanted to make sure Oklahoma City broadened the areas of looking at where those experts are. So we recommended that something be done to make sure that there was a more open application process or information gathering space where other community-based programs could come in. Inside the working group, we learned that the police is open to partnering with any mental health agency that's interested. That when they started their pilot program, which they call TRUST, I believe is what the acronym is, the North Care was the one that said, we'll do this with you. But if there was any other community-based group that was interested in stepping into this space with them, they would very much want to know that. In fact, we were asked by the department on Tuesday, could you get them in touch with us ASAP? So in some ways, we were trying to just make sure that the city was considering all different opportunities for community-based groups who might be doing this work beyond just one. What we also offer, and you can see, I think it's in this section. Let me double check. North Care can do what they're already doing, and this pilot is going forward. And if this pilot's the best model to build from, then that's fine. But we really want to make sure that the city starts from here and builds up in and deeper. And so that was the purpose of this, deeper and wider. Honestly, I joked around with Grace in the last working group that it was because of my conversations with you all that we really pushed forward to make sure that we were extending resources out. So we catch it, we hear you, we haven't languaged this out right, and we need to do better. So we're going to shift this language going forward in another iteration. Did I touch on your question enough?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I'm also wondering though, and I could be wrong, but the way I read this, it was that there had been an evaluation. Yeah, the last sentence, page 14, however, other than North Care, no other community-based resources capable of taking on this work were identified. What I'm wondering is what was the process for identifying them?
The police department, in their efforts to do this pilot program, put out an ask for community-based providers to come to the table with them and talk through this. I don't know more about the process, and we can let them answer from here, but it wasn't a formal RFI as much as an ask for a committee-like structure to come to the table. North Care was the only one that showed up.
Okay, and so I guess that's the other thing. The alternative response program, though, is supposed to be a non-police response. It was an alternative. So I guess that's where I'm also kind of confused. I didn't know what, like, is it the police that are putting out the RFI? Like, what is the process there?
Well, our recommendation is that the city should do the RFI and that the city should consider what kind of alternative response models could be out there with other community resources. And so there should be a deeper investment by the city to look at their resources broader than just this one thing, to see who else is out there who could be a good partner in this space. And that could be citywide based. So that's why the recommendation reads for the city to do it. I think we're getting nuanced here. There's a few more recommendations that go down this space, talk about it a little different, but hopefully I'm touching base on your questions. We have other ones, other questions. Cherie Dickerson's next.
Thank you, Jessica. I was really, a lot of the concerns or questions that Joshua brought up, mine are very similar, especially around the language. And I heard you acknowledge that it does need to be modified because it caused confusion. It does seem to be a strong preference or already an affiliation of intent to connect with North Care. And so I know from people within the community that would be problematic. And I think that their voices and those that are the most impacted should be the ones that give heavy influence to what is actually happening. And so the public, many people, these recommendations have already been released, and that was the number one thing that we started getting questions out, being members of the task force. So I also want to encourage, since we know the language needs to be changed, that one, maybe something publicly be acknowledged, that we are aware of the concerns and how the language was put out, and that we are making a very expeditious effort to change that. And to make sure that they understand that we're not saying it's going to be North Care, and that that this is not something that's affiliated. Like Josh said, it is an alternative to having police interaction in a mental health crisis. Because this has started a fire. We didn't have to.
Totally understand, and thank you for that feedback. So we are going to work on that, and we'll figure out how to get that out publicly as we address that. There'll be other iterations of this report too, which we will commit to making it better clear. We definitely wanted to make that clear. We wrote this with your voices in mind, so we're sorry that it didn't land the way you wanted it to. Grace?
Yeah, I just wanted to just kind of go back to the recommendation itself. And I don't know if there needs to be, I've noticed all the recommendations, the language around it, right? So there's a preface, there's some statements out in the alternative mental health responses that is known, that is a practice in all of these, is that there is a community-based mental health agency that's also out on the ground. And I think that's really important to say, even if we're talking, even if it's not in the recommendation, I think that's important to say, because what we're saying is the most impacted communities need to be comfortable also with the alternative mental health response. And what we know about Black, brown, and poor communities, even with white people, even in our non-English speaking who are not Latinx, maybe they're Asian, or that there has to be a lot of cultural competency when we're talking about mental health responses. Because in Oklahoma, that's not something that's quite as normal as it is other places. So I think that needs to be said, that there is an importance to have community-based communities, and that has been backed up in research as well, and also in the STAR program. I think we already discussed, in detail the language in there, and I said in the other form, and I just want to say in this one that I do think the pilot program that North Carolina has with the police department right now, which is a resource, so they give resources to people who need that, I think that's excellent. I don't think that is the same thing as the mental health alternative response, and it does not qualify them to do that. It doesn't disqualify them, but it doesn't automatically qualify them. And I just want that's the big concern. We don't want people to feel like something is being snatched away from the public, like the smaller community agencies can't even apply, that they can't even get on the table with this. We just want to make sure that it's not just open, but fair, accessible, and it's equity in the process. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanisha. I'll turn it back to you, or Brian.
Hello, can you all hear me?
We can now.
Thank you. Forgive me, I could not locate the hand raising button, or I would have pressed it earlier, but such is life in 2021. I had just a few notes, if I might. One of them is, I'll just work in reverse here. So on this item, yeah, I think I just want to echo all the concerns I just heard from Josh and Grace and Reverend Dickerson. I think all of those are precisely my concerns, from the cultural competency aspect being the most important one, but kind of onward. I think the major sentence that confuses me on this one is the, however, other than North Care, no other community-based resources capable of taking on this work were identified. I hear what Jessica described earlier in terms of that the police sending out, whatever calls that they did for folk to come partner with them. I think my problem with this sentence relates more to Grace and Josh's presentation where they identified a long list of providers in the community that are more culturally competent with the various communities we in need of these sorts of services. So that sentence is pretty troublesome to me in that regard, and it implies North Care is capable of doing this work, whereas we just heard Grace say like maybe they are. So because the current program they're doing is not, as in my mind when I helped craft this language for the resolution, in my mind strongly was something like the STAR program in Denver, Cahoots, and Eugene. Those were always the two models. So that's my first thing I would really want to note here, is just echoing the concerns we just heard about cultural competency and making sure that our language notes the folk who Grace and Josh noted in their presentation. I know both of them talked to me about the group of people, a list of people they had reached out to, healthcare providers. I also just last week toured our diversion hub. I think it was last Thursday, a week ago today. And Megan and Margarita Shaw told me that they had met with Assistant City Manager Soodle and also provided a list of culturally competent mental health care providers who a grave concern for Margarita and Megan is that in implementing this an alternative mental health care response, that we would miss this opportunity to make sure we have people who are very well versed in the communities they would be serving. So I would want to also circle back to that list that Assistant City Manager Soodle, my understanding from Margarita and Megan, has received from the diversion hub. So that's that on this item. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that, because I do have a few other points that are not on this item. But if anyone wants to say anything about that. Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing before a response. I'm also missing here around this. I saw the different approaches that existed in that preface that Grace referenced. I was kind of looking in terms of a recommendation for more of a, well, which one of these approaches might we take? Is it a co-responder model, or is it more of the Denver STAR model? So I'm kind of curious what you all might say about that as well. Thank you.
So, Councilman Cooper, I will, I really want to respond to the first part, because it's clear we missed the mark on this recommendation here. And, even as we read the language and we talked about this in the working group, that last line that talks about no other community-based resources were identified, that really was talking about the police department's outreach, but that sentence in no way is linked to that. So that was just poorly crafted, and I apologize for that. The entire concept here that we were trying to lay out, and we will fix this, and moving forward, and there's going to be a lot more context around it. Again, this is the pitfall of providing some but not all context to a recommendation. So we have, certainly we have lists of people that may be able to do this. Once we design a program like this, and let's just pick that we're going with a Kahoot STAR model where it is completely police independent. Those are nonprofit based systems. So the question is really, of the people on the list, who actually has the capacity to ideally have a 24/7 response, have a timely response, has the relationships and the access to treat people once they are transported, once they are assisted, that the follow-up is there. I think there's a lot of things that need to be fleshed out. And the whole point here is not to be prescriptive about it. So when you talk about cultural competency, that could be, that should be part of what is put into the request for information. And that's why when I look at this, I think about more like a Venn diagram, or different spheres, because one service is not going to necessarily cover the whole city. It's going to cover different neighborhoods, different communities, and come from those communities. And that's all great, but you got to put together that resource map completely. And if, I can't, I wish I could disavow the language and we can start over with this one. But the point is, we need a complete capacity assessment of who can do what and how they all work together. And that's really what we're looking is, how do you create the network here? Does that help?
Yes, that network language is spot on, and serving those folk in need, I think, is spot on. And then I would also say, whatever I'm as different cities are implementing, as you all are noting, these different alternative responses, we've also been learning what some of those pitfalls are, right? Like, there's a reason Denver goes from 200,000 to 1.4 million. What you mentioned, capacity of the folk on that list. So for me, I would want to start anticipating what are some of those, what are going to be some of those limitations in terms of this $300,000 we are setting aside to begin these initial investments, and start also plotting where we need to be going in terms of scaling up based on what we're learning about the minefields that other cities have stepped on in this last year. So that would be something I would hope to see in some revisions here as well. Otherwise, I mean, it's just that this one, I mean, they're all so important. This one just is, as you all know, has my heart. And I want to be very, very careful in building this with the voices of the community who have been giving us their feedback on co-responder models and trained mental health professionals being the one doing this. So that's just very important to me. If there's nothing else on this particular one, I do have just a couple quick other notes. I think they should be quick, but okay.
I'll take a maybe a point of personal privilege if I have one. As a person who, you know, worked very hard in Baltimore City in the mayor's office of criminal justice to try and create a space for Black and Brown community-based organizations that normally do not have a place at the table. I think it's critical that what comes out of these recommendations and an understanding of everybody involved with putting this together moving forward is that this, what you guys want as a city only works when you are doing one of two things: making sure that people that do have the capacity show up to serve the residents to the best of their ability, but also not making hurdles and excuses for people who do have cultural competence that is very important to Black and Brown communities, but have not been given the financial resources, have not been given the ability to reach those larger facilities. And so that this is a conversation that continues, and that whether it's one or the other or a combination of two, what I heard from the community is that if the community-based organizations are not given a chance and are not made a critical part of this process, then you will be back here in this very same place that called you to put together a task force in the first place. So we will definitely work to correct that language and make that clear. But I also just wanted to say that for the folks who are going to have to come together and move this forward, that has to be forefront in your mind. I think I saw, oh, I'm sorry, Councilman, go ahead. I was going to call on Valerie. I saw her next, but certainly go ahead with your other points.
Mostly just to say, I really appreciate the personal point of privilege there. That is, those words very well taken, and I'm very happy with them. As like probably comes as no surprise to you. Just three, these are just line items. We don't have to debate them, but these are just things that I would like to also put as notes for earlier items. Again, I couldn't find the hand raising button. Number one, on the much earlier thing, I'd like to ask us to consider elevating any use of firearm to a type 2 use of force. I think anytime an officer draws a firearm, regardless of whether one uses it, I think that is a slight elevation of things. So I'd like that for consideration. Two, when it comes to CIT officers, keeping in mind just like the alternative mental health calls, this was something we suggested in the resolution. I would ask the question, especially after attending a mental health training with law enforcement last week of new recruits. Thank you, OKC PD, for that. Why could we not just train all new officers in this capacity? Just all of them. Just start, if we really want to like set the tone, set the tone. Next, oh, by the way, I also feel like that would help with recruiting. I think if we say like, this is where we're heading as a city, we believe that for so long, we've asked law enforcement to do this mental health work and we've not really even talked about it. So going forward, so that's just a question I have. And then finally, related to that, I believe we talked about it during the subcommittees, but just updated annual CIT training that is just ongoing and drawing on new best practices. And it, like I said, not really necessarily looking for a debate on those, just wanted to add those as comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Valerie, you're next.
Thank you. I'll keep my comments brief. I'm trying to summarize these in maybe 3 or 4 points. First of all, I recognize that this is not the final report. So I'm hoping that some of the things that I suggest or recommend will show up in the next report or the final report. I want to really applaud Councilman Cooper and Councilwoman Nice and all of the community leaders and people that have been working on the working groups for their hard work. I don't know if they've been given enough credit for all of the things that they've done behind the scenes, but they have really been working hard to get us where we are now. And you can really see some of the fruits of their labor, even though it's not really laid out in this report. I just want to publicly say I appreciate what they've been doing. First of all, I think what the discussion was what's missing. And for me, in reading this document, what's missing for me is a breakdown or an outline of the recommendations with proposed objectives, indicators, outcomes with timelines. So I'm hoping that we will see that in the next report because without outcomes, specific indicators, outcomes, and timelines, we will never get any definitives and it would be hard for the community to follow up. And so I make that recommendation that I hope that we will see that in the next or upcoming reports. The next thing I will say is that there needs to be some type of ongoing communication plan. And I applaud Grace for bringing up the discussion about cultural competency. I was going to try to wait until the end of the discussion to kind of share these things or these thoughts. But I noticed throughout the report, cultural competency was never discussed. And it should be discussed from the beginning of de-escalation through everything that we do with this report. The mental health piece and any accountability piece, because we're making assumptions that everyone is going to receive this information in the same way, and that's not correct. And then again, I really think that there should be an annual report out to the community. And hope that that is laid out in the final report and who should receive that report and how it's distributed to the community. So, and just basically the technology pieces. I saw where in the report, I think it was on page 8 and 9, when we talked about accountability, we were talking about technology. Again, we need to back up and look at how we're communicating to the communities that we serve in Oklahoma City. Not everyone has access to technology or can go through that particular process. So again, what I would urge as we go forward in submitting our final report is look at how we're going to have an ongoing measurement process and who's going to be responsible or accountable for making sure that that is done on an annual basis. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Thompson. And that is absolutely part, I see you over there, Garland. I'll be right there. That is actually what is part and parcel to the very next phase of the report. So we will definitely have those elements there. As well as the cultural competence. That was something that we went back and forth quite a bit. We heard from our indigenous, communities. We heard from a myriad of communities. And so we're going to make sure to add that context and talk about those things in the final draft of the report. I think I saw Josh's hand, and then we'll come over to Garland.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify. So one thing, a lot of people, when they're talking about the Denver STAR program, they'll also mention the word co-responder, but Denver STAR is an alternative response to policing. So, and I was under the impression, and I could be wrong, but I was under the impression that because we were pushing for the study of mental health alternative response, because since it's an alternative response to policing, then it's one that is like separate from or works together with them in the sense, but it's sending mental health care professionals out as a separate service that is addressing mental health care needs with mental health care professionals. That other things like the co-responder model, some of these other, that was no longer, we had moved past that point of determining or making a choice from some of these options. Only because mainly in the working group, we had the study that has been done intensively has to do with the alternative response based on Denver STAR. So this seems like a step back from where that was, but, and I don't know, and I could have just been under the wrong impression. So I don't know, are we looking at like kind of everything still?
Josh, just to clarify, is it you're only making that assumption because people keep referring to a model that has a co-responder model, not because I missed something on this call or in the report that says that, right? The report
Right.
doesn't, yeah, I that hasn't really been part of the conversation. It's been the alternative response. So and Craig, I see your hand up. I don't know if you had something to say about that, but I don't think that that's anything that anybody has really been talking about or put forward.
Well, in the report, I think it recognizes there's multiple different ways this can be structured. I don't know that we've gotten to the point. I haven't seen anything that I agree to from my perspective as we've gone through this discussion that we've ruled out that there'd be a co-responder model. When I use the term, and Josh, I may be using an incorrect term. When I use the term alternative response, to me, it's a term of, it's different than what we're doing now. So it could be a co-responder model, and it could be a just sending out the mental health providers. So I understood that was still an open discussion that was still being vetted, that we're looking at all options for how we would provide this service.
Ganesha, I recognize that Chief, just drew a blank, but the Chief of Police has a question. Basie, Chief Basie.
Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to update. Reverend Dickerson asked a question earlier, and I wanted to get an answer for the group. I thought it was important, and it was about how officers are selected for the CIT program. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to make it really fast. But in short, when we have a school, first thing we have to understand is that the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services coordinates and manages all the training. We can have a class if we have the instructors and coordinate it with them, but we have to have representatives from them in attendance in order to acknowledge and certify the class. So it really hinges upon our coordination with them, and they manage that. But when we do actually have training, we advertise that, and we have CIT applications that are filled out. The basic qualifications are 2 years of field experience. You can't be on any form of disciplinary probation. You have to be assigned to operations or available for immediate transfer to patrol duties. And we do have some unique positions like the hot team or hostage negotiators. Doesn't mean they're on the active roster, but they're trained. We look at their performance evaluations. They have to be up at or above fully competent. We look at your last year's leave record. And basically, the process goes through, they submit that to their supervisor. It's reviewed all the way up and through and signed off by their division commanders so that they can give an opinion on that. And then it's forwarded to the CIT commander for further review. Selections are based upon where we have those holes. And I think Mr. Pruitt mentioned having coverage in the right areas or 24-hour coverage. So we have to make those, we have to fill those vacancies where we have holes. And so that's a big part of it. So you don't have to be assigned in those areas, but you have to be willing to transfer to those areas if you want that position and it's available. So those are just some, I wanted to make sure we answered that question for Reverend Dickerson. Thank you.
And Ganesha, if I could also just kind of finish up what I was responding to Josh. I think also we have to look at where we're going to classify different types of mental health responses as to whether or not there would be a co-responder model or just having mental health response. And I think all of that we're open to the discussion. I just don't think we've refined all of that far enough to say we've concluded this is the only way that we're going to do it.
Okay, we are over
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Craig.
Okay, so this is going to be my concern about that, and I understand what Mr. Freeman is saying, but we have not discussed in detail in the working group the difference between a co-responder response and a non-co-responder model. And if that's what we're doing, then that's different than what's been going on in that group. We have been focusing on an alternative to the police coming out, which means the STARS program, which is what we've been talking about mostly, is an alternative. So it doesn't mean that the police don't ever come, right? So if there's a situation, somebody calls in and says, I'm having a mental health crisis, then the STARS program or the pilot for the alternative mental health response, they would be deployed.
That's not a co-responder. And we haven't really looked at models like that to even compare them. So that's a huge concern, because that's two different things, which maybe that's an issue that we need to flush out more. What are the differences? What are the benefits? And based on successful models, the co-responder, meaning that both go out on every call, that's not, based on research, that's not the most successful. So I don't know if we need to go maybe flush out terms more, or maybe kind of verify what we're talking about. But an alternative to a 911 call is so that officers don't have to go to everything. The point is for a certified specialist that's licensed to come out and handle the mental health. And if they need something, or if something is different when they get on scene and they can recognize it immediately, then they contact officers when needed. The point is to free up officers to be elsewhere. So I guess that's something that really hasn't been discussed in the working group, a co-responder model. So I don't know if we need to go revisit that or what, but I do want to point that out. Thank you.
Hey, Ganesh, if I can jump in on this, because I'm on some of these subcommittees with Josh and Grace, and I'm under the impression that this was still a work in progress, that Grace and Joshua have done some really great research on the different programs, but I don't think our subcommittees met in a couple of weeks. Maybe we didn't meet in July, and I was expecting there was more conversation to be had on the total alternative, the co-responder, but more importantly, that decision tree at the dispatch level, to help the professionals know who should be going out. And so I still felt like it was a work in progress, although Grace and Joshua have done tremendous work on getting us started down that alternative pathway.
So what it sounds like to me, particularly because it's a working group issue, is that and I don't want to speak for you, Jessica, but that we have been still meeting, and that this may be a conversation that needs to come back up in the next working group meeting.
Yeah, I don't want to
Sounds like to
confuse
me.
terms here. This is not a subcommittee of the task force. This was a topic within the working group. It
Yeah.
was discussed. Grace and Josh have done an outstanding body of work to produce information around stars and cahoots. And certainly the working group deserves credit for investing time in that process to hear and consider it. But there can be more done to dive deeper into the different models, assuming the working group wants to be participants in giving feedback in that space, which I hope they do.
ACM Sudal.
I was kind of going to say the same thing Tim said, but also just one other point is, there's some legal issues right now around the state law, requiring law enforcement to do transport. The issue with the 988 that I mentioned, that is looking at a alternative response, much like what Josh and Grace are talking about. So I was just going to make the point that I think it's still a work in progress, and it might even be an iterative process. It might even be where we start off with the co-response, moving to an alternative response. So I just think there's more work to be done, was going to be my point there.
And I
Real
should
quick,
add
just
that-
to, oh, sorry,
Well,
just to say
I
the
should-
legal lead. Oh, sorry.
Let me say this real quick, Josh. I do think the direction of the working group was understanding there's a pilot in place and that there was something happening, but considering alternative responses. And there was a lot of discussion outside of Grace and Josh's presentation about how to build from around. And we got tied up in the bureaucracy of it, the cost, the considerations, and those pieces. So we'll revisit that to flesh it out more and get more feedback from a broader audience.
And I don't want to belabor this any longer either. I want to make sure you understand when my response isn't argumentative at all. My response is I just didn't understand that. And I really love the idea. I'm very open to the idea. If we identify types of calls where we could have an alternative response that is solely a mental health responder, I support that. I like that concept. I hadn't received enough information yet where I was clear that that was a decision, because there's so many different levels calls that involve mental health issues. So I agree with what everyone is saying, that a deeper dive with the working group is really warranted. And I'm definitely open to whatever the group is looking at here.
Oh, yeah, I just want to be clear. I'm not argumentative. I'm just trying to make sure we're all on the same page. And if we need to go back and look at, the co-responders and dive deeper into that and look at, then my concern is that we haven't done it that way to compare the models. And if that's what we need to do, and if that's what, folks are looking for, even within the group, let's do that. But thus far, that's not what happened. That's not what has happened. And also, in the vein of an alternative, that's what I thought we were looking for, is an alternative to 911 coming out. But that's okay. We can look at all the models. My concern is that we haven't looked at all the models, if that makes sense, to talk about them in depth. And if that's what we need to do, that's what we can do.
I'll also only note, in the spirit of not being combative either, the language itself in the resolution does, in fact, to Grace and Josh's point, say alternative response. So, you all did the correct work. When you've heard me in a meeting like this use the phrase co-responder, it's largely based on listening, as you all just heard for yourself, to City Manager Freeman, hearing, thinking about, well, what level and where might be appropriate. So that's why you're hearing that from me, is I know what I'm after, which is that Denver model. I know what, I've asked you all to explore, of course, what the words in that resolution ask us to explore. And I've been listening to City Manager Freeman, and I've been learning more about these other things. So I don't think you all have done incorrect work, is what I would say.
Okay, wanting to be respectful of folks' time. It is 14 minutes past our time to be here. I know, Garland, I'm going to come to you last, because you were skipped about for 5 people. So we'll come to you and ask you what you have to say, and then we'll dismiss. I sound like we're at school. Go ahead, Garland. Are you speaking, Garland?
Yes.
Okay.
Someone asked the question earlier whether or not the CBT, whether or not the training was effective. That's the whole purpose of that training. But my comment, they also asked the question as to whether or not there's a model that has done it. Midwest City is doing it with 100%, and they've had any killings in years and years and years. So I like what Cooper said when he made mention of those new trainees need to be trained in those particular areas, but I noticed that they had a criteria. If you got to fix, change, and correct that criteria in order to achieve a master what we're after, then let that be part of that process also. There's the need, it's effective, there's a model, and the only reason we're talking about it or discussing or having any conversation concerning it is because there's a need. We're in a crisis right now. We number 2 in the country. We don't want to be there. We don't want to be there. And we don't have to be there. And that's the purpose of all of this, is to fix, change, and correct it, and to do some things that we know will work. So I love that new ideas for the 988, put it in the mix. The other alternative was anybody other than NorCal, and anybody else, anybody that's going to help us get to where we're trying to go. We support it, endorse it, recommend it, and we can't wait to put it in place.
Thank you, Garland. I think those are perfect words to end it on. I do want to just echo what Dr. Thompson said earlier. We thank you. We could not be here. This process would be for naught. For many of you who showed up for multiple meetings, putting off personal things and professional obligations, to pour in, to have listening sessions, to bring in the community so that we can make sure to hear their voice, to bring in mental health response folks. And so really do thank you. This is, again, just a milestone. So please continue to send in to us any thoughts. I'm always available to have one-on-one conversations with you. Some of the subcommittees may be reconvened. We were trying to see how much came out of here that we need to go back and work on. So we will be in contact with you for any of the subcommittees to reconvene. So we'll continue to work on putting that context, putting those deadlines and outcomes into the next draft. And if you all have any questions or concerns in the interim, please make sure to reach out.
Anita, I do. I'm sorry. I know everyone wants to go. And maybe City Manager Freeman or Assistant City Manager Soodle and someone. What are the next steps right now? I know Anita, you just mentioned there might be the opportunity of reconvening certain groups, but what kind of timeline are we heading toward in terms of these a final set of recommendations appearing before council?
So I'll give a little bit of an overview and then anybody else can speak into it. So we're looking to have the final report done by September 30th so that we can present that to you all in October. And so if the subcommittees are reconvened, that would happen between now and probably mid-September, just to make sure that we feed into that. And then I think you all have some other processes. I'm not sure once it gets to the desk of the city manager when it gets to council.
Yeah, Ganesha, I can respond and Craig can jump in, but I think our thought was if we do make that September 30th deadline and it's presented to the working group and the task force and sort of finalized in October, that we would try to then bring it to you all at city council, the mayor and council at, pretty quickly thereafter. So maybe that's November, a November council meeting, but we're kind of was a little bit non-committal about that in the press conference this week, because again, just trying to think through the timing of when those task force meetings are. And, that we have some lead time on getting things onto city council, but that would be kind of sort of the timeline we would be thinking there. And then at that point, if council accepted, the recommendations, approved the recommendations, that at that point, it's really the city manager's office and the police department began the implementation process. And there's going to be some things that could be potentially implemented quickly. And there's some things that, could take time, or even as we've talked here for many weeks, if there's legislative changes or bargaining that has to happen or budgetary issues, all those things. So I think that's part of that final assessment is sort of the sequencing and what's the low hanging fruit and what's kind of the longer term things we have to work toward.
Yeah, Kenny answered. I don't have anything more to add on that. I think that's exactly what we would plan to do. And I think all of us working together through this to make sure we've got all the voices coming in from the task force and the working group to come together for that final recommendation.
Thanks everyone for your very detailed and helpful responses. They're very appreciative. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for your very kind words for us earlier. That was very lovely. And it's 21C, thank you as well. Just thank you, everybody. I mean, the work continues, I suppose.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day and evening.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.